The desert becomes something else when the sun slips below the horizon. Heat drains out of the sand with startling speed, leaving behind a surface that hardens and cools as darkness spreads. Wind moves low across the ground, dragging fine grains of dust against stone and bone, producing a faint, constant sound that never fully disappears. By day, the desert exposes everything tracks, etched into sand carcasses left behind hunters and the hunted moving in plain sight. At night, it conceals far more than it reveals. Under a moonless sky, the only light comes from distant stars, sharp and indifferent. Shapes lose their edges. Distances become deceptive. Movement, once obvious, turns subtle and restrained. Animals that dominated the daylight withdraw into stillness, not out of fear, but out of calculation. In the desert, night does not belong to the fastest or the strongest. It belongs to those that understand timing and the cost of being seen. Somewhere between fractured rock faces and dry, empty valleys, an influence settles over the landscape without announcing itself. There is no chase, no clash, no sign of pursuit. Instead, there are absences. A carcass that will not be there by morning, a scent trail that fades before dawn, a hesitation that spreads through the small, nocturnal lives waiting beneath the sand and stone. The desert night runs on signals that cannot be heard, and even the slightest shift is enough to alter the rhythm of survival. Insects slow their movement. Small mammals delay their emergence. Even seasoned predators abandon places where they once fed. Not because danger has appeared, but because something unseen might arrive. Here, survival is not decided only by who makes the kill. It is shaped by what happens afterward, by who comes later, and by what is quietly removed from the system before the sun returns. Night in the desert is not an empty pause between 2 days. It is its own battleground, governed by restraint rather than force. Decisions made in silence determine which lives continue and which traces vanish without evidence. And within that silence, there exists a presence that does not need to hunt, fight, or reveal itself to matter. Its mere possibility is enough to make the desert hesitate, adjust, and endure until first light. When the desert finally gives way to full darkness, the animals that matter most are rarely the ones that announce themselves. Among the scattered rocks and dry riverbeds moves a species built not for speed or spectacle, but for endurance and restraint. The striped hyena does not dominate the landscape through force. It occupies a quieter position, one that allows it to shape the desert without ever needing to control it. Compared to the powerful hunters of open terrain, the striped hyena appears almost unremarkable at first glance. Its body is lean rather than imposing, its gait measured instead of explosive. The coarse mane along its back rises and falls with subtle tension, not aggression. This is not an animal designed for pursuit. It does not rely on bursts of speed or overwhelming strength. Its survival strategy lies elsewhere, in patience, memory, and an acute sensitivity to what the desert leaves behind. Striped hyenas rarely initiate conflict. They are neither apex predators nor passive bystanders. Instead, they operate in the margins of other animals' decisions. They arrive after the struggle has ended, after the blood has dried, and the winners have moved on. In doing so, they assume a role that is less visible but far more influential. What they consume, what they ignore, and what they remove entirely determines how long death lingers in the desert and how dangerous the night becomes for everything else. Their senses are tuned not for chasing prey, but for reading the aftermath of survival. A faint scent carried on cooling air. A disturbance in the sand that suggests something once struggled there. The striped hyena navigates vast, harsh territories, using memory as much as instinct, returning to places where opportunity tends to appear rather than forcing encounters of its own. In an environment where energy is precious, this efficiency is not a weakness. It is an advantage refined by generations. Within the desert ecosystem, striped hyenas occupy a decisive position in the flow of life and decay. By removing carcasses quickly and thoroughly, they reduce the spread of disease, limit the attraction of pests, and prevent dangerous concentrations of scavengers. Their presence shortens the lifespan of death itself. In doing so, they quietly regulate the risks that follow every hunt, every failed escape, every animal that does not survive the day. This role grants them a form of influence that extends far beyond their numbers. Other animals do not need to see a striped hyena to react to it. The possibility of its arrival is enough. A carcass left unattended becomes less predictable. A feeding site becomes temporary rather than permanent. In the desert, predictability can be lethal. The striped hyena ensures that very little remains predictable once night falls. It is through this restraint, this refusal to compete directly, that striped hyenas endure where more aggressive strategies fail. They do not seek dominance. They maintain balance. And in a landscape where survival depends on timing as much as strength, that balance makes all the difference. As night deepens, the influence of the striped hyena extends far beyond its physical movement. The desert does not wait to confirm its presence. It reacts in advance. Across the dunes and rocky flats, animals adjust their behavior based on a calculation that has been shaped over generations. The understanding that once darkness settles, the rules change. Small nocturnal mammals are the first to respond. Creatures that normally emerge quickly after sunset linger longer inside burrows and crevices, listening, testing the air. Their survival depends on timing, and timing becomes uncertain when scavengers capable of stripping a carcass clean might be moving nearby. A delayed emergence can mean fewer feeding opportunities, but it also reduces exposure to a night that has become unpredictable. Insects alter their patterns as well. Swarms thin out around sites where death has recently occurred. The absence of lingering remains denies them an easy resource, forcing them to disperse rather than concentrate. This subtle shift ripples outward. Where insects do not gather, the animals that feed on them hesitate. The desert's food web tightens contracts and redistributes itself, all without a single confrontation taking place. Even established predators respond. Carnivores that have made a kill during the day rarely return to it after nightfall. Not because the striped hyena challenges them directly, but because its arrival changes the value of the site. A carcass that will not last becomes a liability rather than a resource. Remaining nearby increases the risk of injury, infection, or conflict with other scavengers drawn in by scent. In the desert, efficiency often means knowing when to leave. This avoidance creates empty spaces, zones where activity fades faster than expected. Paths that would normally see movement remain unused. Water sources experience quieter hours. The striped hyena's influence is not defined by territory in the traditional sense. It is defined by uncertainty. Animals do not know exactly where it is, only that it might be near, and that is enough to alter decisions. Over time, these repeated adjustments reshape nightly routines. Survival becomes less about aggression and more about restraint. The desert, already unforgiving, becomes a place where hesitation can be protective rather than costly. Through its indirect impact, the striped hyena enforces a kind of discipline on the ecosystem, ensuring that nothing lingers too long and nothing becomes too predictable. By the time the night reaches its deepest hours, the landscape has settled into a quieter, leaner rhythm. Fewer risks are taken. Fewer resources are wasted. The striped hyena may never be seen, but its effect is unmistakable. In the desert after dark, survival is no longer dictated solely by strength or speed. It is governed by awareness and by the silent pressure of a presence that reshapes behavior without ever demanding attention. When a carcass is left behind in the desert, it becomes a brief focal point in an otherwise sparse landscape. Heat slows its decay during the day, preserving it longer than expected. But once night arrives, that pause ends. The striped hyena approaches without urgency, reading the scene rather than rushing into it. there is no need for speed. Time is already on its side. Unlike scavengers that compete through aggression, the striped hyena relies on precision. Its jaws are built to handle what others cannot. Dry hide, splintered bone remnants, stripped of value by earlier feeders. What remains after a hunt is often dangerous rather than nourishing, carrying bacteria and parasites that can spread quickly if left untouched. By consuming these remains, the striped hyena does more than feed itself. It interrupts a process that could otherwise destabilize the night. As it feeds, the carcass is reduced methodically, not torn apart in chaos, but erased piece by piece. Each minute that passes lowers the risk for other animals. Scent fades. Insects lose their attraction. The sight stops drawing attention. What was once a beacon of danger becomes just another patch of cooling sand. By morning, there is often no trace left to mark where death occurred. This quiet removal has consequences that extend far beyond a single feeding event. When carcasses vanish quickly, scavenger populations remain dispersed. No single location becomes crowded or contested. Disease struggles to gain a foothold. Predators are less likely to injure themselves, returning to old kills. The desert remains harsh, but it stays functional. What the striped hyena chooses not to eat matters as much as what it does. Bones left scattered become calcium sources for smaller animals. Fragments buried in sand enrich soil that will later support sparse plant life. Even absence creates opportunity. In an ecosystem defined by scarcity, nothing is wasted, not even what disappears. Through these actions, the striped hyena exerts a form of control that is invisible but constant. It does not compete for dominance. It manages consequences. Every carcass removed shortens the lifespan of danger. Every night it feeds, the desert becomes slightly less volatile than it would have been otherwise. This is not the power of a hunter deciding who dies. It is the influence of a scavenger determining what remains. In the desert after dark, that distinction matters. Survival is shaped not only by the moment of death, but by how long death is allowed to linger. As the desert moves through its seasons, survival becomes less about single nights and more about endurance across years. For striped hyenas, this endurance is built into every stage of their life cycle. Reproduction does not follow abundance, it follows caution. In an environment where resources are unpredictable, breeding is timed to minimize exposure rather than maximize numbers. Dens are established in places that offer concealment rather than comfort, rock crevices. Abandoned burrows, shallow caves, carved into dry ground. These sites are chosen not for proximity to food, but for safety and stability. Inside them, the next generation grows in darkness, insulated from the extremes outside. The desert does not forgive mistakes, and striped hyenas reduce risk wherever possible. The young are born into a world where noise attracts danger. Early development is slow. Movement is limited. Learning begins long before independence, shaped by observation and repetition rather than play. Cubs become familiar with scents before they understand distance. They learn which smells signal opportunity and which signal threat. This early exposure forms the foundation of their future efficiency. Parental care in striped hyenas is defined by restraint. Adults do not bring back fresh kills or engage in dramatic displays of provisioning. Instead, nourishment comes from what the desert provides after others have finished. This teaches the young a crucial lesson. Survival does not depend on control, but on awareness. Knowing when to arrive matters more than arriving first. As the cubs grow, they are gradually introduced to the rhythms of the night. Short movements away from the den become longer excursions. Familiar routes are repeated until they are memorized. The desert is vast, but successful survival depends on a detailed understanding of specific places where carcasses are likely to appear, where competitors tend to pass through, and where retreat is always possible. This slow, deliberate upbringing produces adults that are neither reckless nor aggressive. Striped hyenas mature into animals shaped by efficiency rather than force. They avoid unnecessary conflict because conflict wastes energy. They avoid predictability because predictability invites danger. Their lives are not dramatic, but they are remarkably consistent. In a landscape where many species struggle to raise even a few offspring to maturity, this strategy pays off. The striped hyena persists not because it dominates, but because it endures. Generation after generation, its presence remains steady, reinforcing the quiet systems that keep the desert from tipping into chaos. The true measure of the striped hyena's importance becomes clear only when its influence is removed. In regions where populations decline or disappear, the desert does not become calmer. It becomes unstable. What was once quietly regulated begins to accumulate, and the consequences unfold slowly, then all at once. Carcasses linger longer in the open. Heat preserves them during the day, and without a reliable scavenger to dismantle them at night. They become centers of contamination. Insects gather in dense numbers. Bacteria multiply. Parasites spread outward through contact and proximity. The night grows heavier, not with predators, but with risk. Other scavengers are drawn in competing more aggressively for the same remains. Where striped hyenas once kept feeding sites, brief and unpredictable absence allows repetition. The same locations are revisited night after night, increasing the chance of injury and conflict. Opportunistic predators linger longer than they should, exposing themselves to fights and infections that would otherwise be avoided. Small animals feel the change quickly. Concentrated insect populations alter feeding patterns. Rodents take greater risks, drawn toward areas that now promise resources but deliver danger. Disease moves more easily through crowded pathways. The desert's fragile balance begins to tilt, not because a hunter has vanished, but because a regulator is gone. Environmental pressures amplify the problem. During droughts or periods of scarcity, the buildup of remains accelerates decay into toxicity. Water sources become compromised. Feeding grounds lose their neutrality. What should be temporary moments of death turn into persistent hazards that shape movement across entire territories. In this altered landscape, survival becomes harsher rather than easier. The absence of restraint forces other species into constant adjustment. Energy is wasted on competition instead of conservation. Injuries accumulate. Mortality rises quietly without spectacle, driven by a system that has lost one of its stabilizing forces. The striped hyena never needed to dominate the desert to matter. Its role was never about control through power. It was about containment. By limiting how long death remained present, it prevented escalation. When that function disappears, the desert reveals how dependent it was on a creature that rarely drew attention. Here, the greatest challenge is not an enemy with teeth or claws, but imbalance. The striped hyena's contribution is measured not in victories, but in what never happens in outbreaks, avoided conflicts, reduced, and nights that pass without consequence. In the desert, that quiet prevention is the highest form of survival. As the first light returns to the desert, the signs of the night's decisions are almost impossible to find. The sand looks undisturbed. The air carries no trace of struggle. What happened hours earlier has been folded back into the landscape, absorbed without ceremony. This is how balance survives here, not through force, but through disappearance. The striped hyena does not remain to witness the morning. By the time shadows shorten and heat begins to rise, it is already withdrawn, leaving behind a desert that functions as it should. Death has not been allowed to linger. Danger has not been permitted to concentrate. The night has passed without escalation. In ecosystems defined by scarcity, survival depends on limits. Every kill, every failure, every loss carries the potential to destabilize what little remains. The striped hyena exists to shorten that window of risk. It ensures that consequences do not outlast necessity. In doing so, it protects animals that will never encounter it and preserves processes that operate far beyond a single species. This is not the kind of influence that draws attention. It does not roar chase or conquer. It works quietly after the moment everyone else remembers. And yet without it, the desert would be louder, dirtier, and far more dangerous than it appears. The striped hyena does not decide who dies. That is left to hunger chance and the unforgiving conditions of the desert. What it decides is what remains afterward. In a landscape where survival is measured in restraint, that distinction is everything. When night falls again, the cycle will repeat. And once more, an animal almost never seen will shape the fate of the desert simply by ensuring that nothing is allowed to stay too long.